So, this is the first video in a series of videos that I will do for my Pokemon Speedrunning League friends. This one will cover the idea of playstyles and win conditions, and in general, both the pace and the style of your team, because everything else that you do in a draft depends on your sort of your structure, your team structure. Your play is influenced by your team structure. Your prep will be influenced by your team structure. Your draft will both dictate, in the first picks, it will dictate your future team structure. But after a while, when you already have a few Pokemon, they will form a certain structure and they will also dictate the rest of your draft. So almost everything in a draft league will be influenced by your pace and your style. So what do I mean by pace and style? Pace indicates how fast you want your games to go. You can go. Generally, it's a direct correlation with how offensive your team is. If you have a lot of very high at offense Pokemon and very little like recovery moves and whatnot, games will go very fast. If you have a lot of recovery moves and not much all out offense, games will go very slow. So I say from fast to slow, but essentially what this means, let me actually type it out. What this means is hyper offense, bulky offense, balance, semi-stall, and stall. They're essentially the same thing. It's those are definitions that might be more familiar with you, but what they practically mean is just the pace of the game that you want to enforce. So on top of that, obviously your style will also depend a lot on your plan to win. Like, what do you plan on doing to actually, get a victory? In other words, your win condition. The concept of win conditions is one that is absolutely crucial in Pokemon, because it's something that, especially after Team Preview was introduced in Black and White, when you see 6 Pokemon already from before turn 1, you can already piece down what a player will have to do to win, and so that's something that you really need to practice and learn to get better at Pokemon. And the first step to understanding win condition is that there are generally 3 types of win conditions. One is setup. This can mean a lot of things. For example, in Hyper Offense, which is the style that does setup more naturally, it's the traditional, I don't know, rain, for example. It's not like actual like direct setup. It's not like a Swords Dance or a move like that, but it is boosting your stats with, I don't know, an external factor of some sorts, pumping up your stats so that you can force an issue and force your opponents to react to what you're doing. They have to either prevent you from pumping up your stats, or they have to find a way to withstand what you're doing despite you pumping up your stats. And so setup accelerates the game because you pose a threat on your opponent, and your opponent has to either find an answer or perish. So hyper offense works very well with setup. And that means in the scope of hyper offense specifically, since you're trying to accelerate the game so much, you're trying to go as fast as possible. That often means moves that will cheat out a stupid amount of stats without even using up a turn, like Drizzle, for example. Drizzle plus Swift Swim means that you don't have to waste a single turn sitting around. You just, without having to click any moves, you already have twice the speed on your Swampert and 1.5 times the attack on your Waterfall, to make the classic example. So that's very good. That's great for speeding up games, because you just set the rain, then you send your Swampert, you force an issue. You say to your opponent, do you have an answer to this setup threat? I know it's not considered traditional setup, but practically they are the same thing. It's just that once you slow down your pace, if you're playing bulky offense or balance, you don't need to accelerate the game as much because you have more bulkiness, more potential to kind of last a bit longer. So you don't need to like make the best out of every single turn. You can take a turn or two to slow down. You can take a turn to sword dance. It's fine. You don't need to be that offensive with your play. So if you take a turn to Swords Dance, you still pose a gigantic threat, and you can still use that Swords Dance to achieve a victory. But what you're essentially doing is just trying to use that Swords Dance to win the game, but not as fast as Hyper Offense. You don't need to go all out. Another good example of Hyper Offense is Sticky Webs. Sticky Webs will almost always get cleared because almost everyone has a defog, but the point of Sticky Web is to force that defog so that your opponent has to waste a turn and power up your Defiant user at the same time. Because if your opponent just plays with Sticky Webs on his side, it's very likely that he will lose due to how Sticky Webs team are generally structured. So once again, yes, you use a turn to set up a Sticky Web, which is low, but what that turn essentially means is that the opponent will be forced to waste a turn back in the future and also gives you a +2 attack to your Defiant user. So essentially you are, once again, gaining momentum, gaining setup, gaining immediate threat without needing to waste any turns. Balance, on the other hand, can play a lot more slower, can play, I don't know, mons like Garchomp are typical balance Pokemon. You can be there and just kind of chill out, and then the opportunity to go in and click Swords Dance comes in, and you take it, and then you use that as a win condition. But in fact, for what I'm trying to say here, essentially, instead of explaining this one concept really well, I'll try to move along a bit quicker and explain the general point. Setup naturally favors very fast playstyle. That's why you see this square is in a darker green than the others. Setup favors a very fast playstyle because the concept of setup is to force the issue. But that type of setup can also be applied just as well to slower paces, because setup is still a win condition that is effective for different teams as well. It doesn't need to be that fast, although it can be, but it doesn't need to be. So it's still perfectly viable for bulky offense, for balance. It becomes less viable for semi-stall, and it's completely unviable for stall, because those are teams that soak in a lot of pressure. They want to slow down the game. They want to be passive, so they don't have the opportunity to get setup rolling. They don't have they don't even want to get setup rolling, because really is not what they do naturally. They want to slow down the game. They don't want to force the issue. Setup forces the issue. So when setup goes well on fast teams, setup goes very poorly on slow teams. And conversely, slow teams want to win by outlasting, which is my other win condition, one of my other win conditions. I'll get to momentum and balance later because it's a mixed bag. There's a lot to talk about, but these two are very basic and symmetrical win conditions. Outlasting is a style that essentially relies on a lot of recovery moves, a lot of just stalling, just not dying. As long as you're not losing any health, you're not losing any progress, you're not losing any ground. So that's the plan, is just not die first and then figure out how to, I don't know, get some advantages, get entry hazards, toxic something, get a seismic toss in every now and then, get all those things like snuck in every now and then over the course of a game that lasts a lot longer. And your opponent will eventually perish faster because some of his mounts will not have recovery, while your team is specifically designed to outlast them, to have recovery moves on a lot of things, to last longer than what your opponent would like you to last. And so if you take 12.5%, it's no big deal because you can just recover it. But if the opponent's Garchomp takes 6.25% from rocks, it's a very small amount that wouldn't matter otherwise. But if you're just trying to outlast, that 6.25% adds up because Garchomp will want to switch in again and again and again. And so he will lose 6.25 again and again and again, and you will lose absolutely nothing because you're covering all of it off. That is the idea of the win condition behind stall. Slow the game down, don't lose health, and as long as the opponent is losing something, even the smallest amount of things, as long as you're not losing anything, then you're fine. Obviously, this just cannot go well at all with fast teams, because fast teams do not have the... You cannot make outlasting a fast playstyle. It just doesn't work on a conceptual level. You cannot force your opponent to take that level of chip damage any quicker. You just have to work it slowly. You have to spend a lot of turns recovering. It doesn't work. You cannot make an hyper offense team that is centered up on residual damage, because residual damage is something that builds up. It doesn't force the issue. It just tries to slow everything down and make everyone just not make any progress until one of the team that has less recovery just slowly dies out. So it's complete opposite of setup, complete opposite in pace, and you can see it in the symmetrical colors as well. This time outlasting can be done perfectly fine by semi-stall, even if you don't have a Chansey, even if you don't have, I don't know, all those crazy Mega Sableye type of hardcore style Pokemon like Pyakamako or Quagsire or all of these weird things. Even if you don't have them, Semi-Stall, which is something like Gliscor, I don't know, Gliscor is probably the quintessential Semi-Stall Pokemon. It doesn't really do too much to like hardcore wall something. It has a very notable ice and water weakness. It's not like perfectly stally because it has like many abusable weak spots, but it still plays in a slightly faster pace because it can do things like taunt, it can do things like Swords Dance, there's a lot of ways to accelerate the issue a little bit, so that's why it's semi-slow, but it still ultimately wins the game by outlasting because it's a real threat when the opponent cannot really land those water or ice wounds on him. And so Gliscor is not a Pokemon that you will see in full stall very often at all, because because it invites pressure a lot. From very specific types of Pokemon, and he doesn't cover as much from any types of Pokemon because he's not like an absolute like beast that will tank too much. Gliscor's bulk is good, but it's like not Mega Aggron levels of good. And so Gliscor cannot really fit in full stall because full stall wants to stay laid back all the time, but he can still accelerate a bit, he can still be played in a semi-stall or in a balance, and he can still do that Poison Nail recovery, play passive, do nothing, but he can also turn up with the Swords Dance, he can also accelerate with U-turns and like taunts and all of those moves that speed up the game a little. So that's what these gradients of color means, because it's not just hyper offense on stall or balance, there are many middle ways, and it is important that you understand where exactly on these scales your team lies. I left balance for last because balance is the hardest one to define. Balance is a team that doesn't fit perfectly with setup, and it doesn't fit perfectly with outlasting either. It doesn't really want to do too much of either. It doesn't want to go too fast because otherwise you're just taking too many risks, and it doesn't want to go too slow because it doesn't have the recovery to go too slow. So what balance usually does is momentum. Now, what does momentum mean? Momentum means Pokemon like um, well, it's a combination of two types of Pokemon generally. It's U-turns, Volt Switch, obviously. That's what you typically think of when you think momentum. Um, Pokemon that can reposition very easily and give you sort of an advantage. But also, a key part of teams that use momentum is the actual wall breakers that you send in. You need something to put that momentum to good use. You need something that uses all of your U-turns and turns them into actual progress. So against hyper offense, that momentum abuser can be something like a choice scarf user because you are faster. Choice scarf users are faster than anything, basically. And so the frail little shits on hyper offense will just die in one hit from your choice scarf user. And so that's if you use your momentum to send a choice scarf user, you will often get kills on hyper offense, and you will often turn the tables on them. You will slow them down because when they die, they have less options, so they cannot as easily force the issue. Um, on the contrary, against Toll, the Pokemon that stifles their game plan is something like a Mega Medicham, something like, I don't know, Swords Dance, Tapu Bulu, that kind of thing that you think is set up, but practically it fits much better in momentum type of teams. Because setup type of teams want to take one burst of setup and really carry it all the way to a victory. Something like Dragon Dance, Charizard X, or Quiver Dance Volcarona. You set up once and everything else dies. Or even like Pelipper with Swampert, you set Rain once and Swampert just kills everything in those 3 or 4 turns, or at least kills enough to make the game practically end, even if it's not fully decided yet. It kills enough to bring the game to a decisive state. So this is what setup really means in this context. It's not like any setup move. It's specifically setup that accelerates the game and forces the issue and leads you to a situation where you're either winning the game on the spot with that setup sweeper, or at least claiming down enough kills so that the rest of the game will be trivial. Meanwhile, something like Swords Dance Tapu Bulu, it's a slower Pokemon, it's still technically set up, but what happens in practice when it does Swords Dance Tapu Bulu is that it will Swords Dance, then it will blow the Bloom Doom, it will do an absurd amount to anything that resists it. He will probably get a kill. But then what happens? What happens is that he's fairly slow, so something faster on the opposing team will probably come to revenge kill it. So he's now really cleaning up. But what happens with Swords Dance Tapu Bulu is that against Stall, they don't really have that revenge killer role. It doesn't really fit in what Stall wants to do. So that kind of Tapu Bulu's Swords Dance thing, if the Stall player doesn't have a direct answer, he just has to lose a Pokemon, and that goes directly against his win condition of Outlasting. Because Outlasting, as I said, is just about not losing anything. And if you lose something, then you're taking a massive blow to that plan. If one of your Pokemon drops, and sometimes, obviously, depending on the situation, you're forced to lose something, and then you have to evaluate which thing is less valuable, which thing you can is more disposable, which thing is less key to your eventual goal of outlasting. But ultimately, Pokemon like Swords Dance Tapu Bulu, Pokemon like Mega Medicham, Mega Mawile, all of those very powerful hitters serve the purpose of dismantling this. And so Momentum, which you vaguely just think of as U-turn and Volt Switch, functionally it's U-turn and Volt Switch plus a bit of hard hitting to dismantle this side, and a bit of choice scarf users or priority users to dismantle this. Because momentum by itself is fairly pointless. If you just U-turn on and on and on, and Volt Switch on and on and on, eventually if that's all that your team can do, your opponent will just bring Rocky Helmets. Your opponent will just bring ground types to answer your Volt Switch and block them. It doesn't get anywhere unless you back up your momentum with threat. And so that's what balance wants to do: momentum and threat. And momentum can also happen manually, which is why balance um, is a bit of tricky to explain, because you can get momentum, you can get the same effect of a U-turn just by getting the correct switchback, by predicting what your opponent will switch to and switch to accordingly. U-turn obviously makes it much safer, but if you're playing a team with less U-turns, you can still make that kind of momentum happen. It will still be a momentum game. It's just that it will be based on forced switches rather than manual U-turning that is a lot easier to manage. So you can still do momentum even if you don't have a terrific Voltron chord, because I don't know, you just need to get that switch into Tornadoes on something that cannot stay in on Tornadoes, and all of a sudden that's all your momentum. You have an advantage because your Tornadoes, even if you have no other U-turns in your team, Tornadoes by itself, once it has a free turn, it can just use that turn to U-turn and bring you all the momentum that you want back, because your opponent will have to switch out of Tornadoes. You turn knowing what they're sending on the field, and then you can answer appropriately, and you can send in your abusers, as I said. So that's kind of how teams win at Pokemon. That's how you win a game of Pokemon, generally speaking. Obviously, there's a few exceptions because this game has a lot of moves, a lot of items, a lot of special things. But this is generally the types of playstyle, the types of schematics, the types of patterns. My pronunciation on that was a bit off. Patterns. That you will find when you play Pokemon, and this happens in almost any tier, pretty much every single tier in Sun and Moon at least. If you go back to the older generations, there are some differences because many moves didn't exist in the same way they do today. But in the state the game is today, this is kind of the balance. Naturally, Hyper Offense wants setup, naturally Balance wants momentum, and naturally Stall wants to outlast. Now you can mix up those things to get to those bulky offense and semi-stall processes. For example, I'll use the example of semi-stall for the team I used last season. I had a Gliscor and I had a Toxapex, so very defensive, very, very much outlasting, or at least that's the idea, what you're attempting with Gliscor and Toxapex. But then I also had a Charizard Y, and that is a prime example of momentum, because again, even though Charizard Y by itself does not provide momentum, it's a key element in the momentum playstyle as an abuser that can be sent in, and with a free turn, it can click Fire Blast and cause a lot of damage and progress your game state in your favor. So it had some elements of outlasting, but also some elements of momentum. And once again, I didn't have too many U-turns to bring the Charizard in, but I could use double switches. And so functionally, since you are playing much slower, with semi-stall, since you're spending a lot of turns with Gliscor and Toxapex, you can sort of get a feel of what your opponent will do. You can understand what he's thinking. You can get a feel for how he answers your plays. And you can do all that without losing much at all, because you can just click Recover over and over, or Roost, and Poison Eel, and Regenerator, and you're not losing much at all the while you're gaining information on how your opponent reacts to your stuff. You get to scout his sets, you get to scout his, hazard setters, all of that. And once you have all of that information, you are in a much better position to do that Charizard switch in. Because you would know, you have a better idea of what your opponent is going to do. And so you can use that to predict that and send your Charizard in and get that massive punish on whatever your opponent is playing. And so that's why semi-stall can do momentum and outlasting, but not as much setup, because when you're playing Gliscor and Toxapex, you're still not terribly interested in accelerating the game too much. You don't have the tools with the Pokemon that want to do outlasting. There are Pokemon that don't have tools for doing setup in the first place. But even if they could, you wouldn't really want to, because that's not your win condition. If you try to do setup while half your team does outlasting, what ends up happening is that the part that tries to do outlasting cannot offer enough support for setup to prosper. You will not have the kind of platform for your Dragon Dancer to really get that free Dragon Dance off, because you have a Gliscor and a Toxapex that will be soaking up a lot of pressure and inviting a lot of pressure. And if you're inviting a lot of pressure, then you don't really have the opportunity to get space for setup, because setup will need a lot of turns. Setup will need a clear hazard field. Setup will need I don't know, maybe screens. Setup will need wish passing if you want to one setup or you want to keep it healthy throughout the game. Maybe have it over more instances of setup, because we all like to see the cleanup where you just click Dragon Dance once and win. But often it's not like that. Often you click Dragon Dance once, you do some progress, but then you have to stop because you've lost too much health, because you're in threat of a Revenge Killer. And then you have to switch out. And then pure setup teams like Balance or Bulky Offense, they will often have things like Healing Wish that will give you momentum, not in the sense of this win condition, but momentum in the sense of a free turn. Because when you Healing Wish, your Pokemon dies, and then you can send your thing for free at full health. And that type of thing is what you really want to favor that kind of cleanup. Maybe cleanup is a better word than setup here for what I want to say. Cleanup type of playstyle. And that's something that Outlasting just does not have the numbers to do, because if Outlasting is using Healing Wish, then it's losing pieces. It's not doing very well at Outlasting. And so it just doesn't work. And on the flip side, if you're bulky offense, if you have a lot of Pokemon that can say that you have bulky offense usually has a fair lot of Volturn and like strong attackers to really use that Volturn, and most of its Pokemon are offensive threats. And you can have setup in, I don't know, something like Dragon Dancers, Quiver Dancers, but even just to some extent, Beast Boost is setup of that kind. If you put, I don't know, Kartana is a great example here. Kartana is a great example of a bulky offense mon. Because it's not exactly useful for anything defensively. Really, what you want Kartana to do is just, at some point, when you have a chance, go in, get a first Beast Boost, and all of a sudden your opponent has a problem. The game accelerates, it's in your favor, the opponent has to have an answer, otherwise the game ends. And that's the kind of thing that really propels bulky offense to the next level, forcing the issue. Because a bulky offense that can do momentum and can do hard hitting, that's all well and good. But if you don't have a true, genuine win condition that you slam on the field and say, okay, answer this or you lose, then all of your wall breaking is not much use. And sometimes you don't actually need setup for bulky offense, but it's often better if you have the option to do setup. Because sometimes, I don't know, like against stall, you don't really need the speed boost from a Dragon Dance, for example. Like, you don't need that kind of setup against stall. Or against semi-stall, very often you don't either. But it's just something that you need to be able to do to pressure the balance and pressure the hyper offense, the speed boost potential, the force your opponent to have an answer to something that is faster and stronger and has potential to kill everything if you let it go unchecked. So this is a bit of a tricky one, but generally speaking, yeah, light green, because bulky offense will mostly play momentum, will mostly play U-turns, will mostly play mega medichams, will mostly play hard hitters, will mostly play that type of thing. But then it also kind of needs the setup to actually handle all the playstyles, because otherwise bulky offense is just not bulky enough, and hyper offense has that immediate speed boost from a rain or a drizzle, or the immediate threat from a sticky web that makes everything in hyper offense be faster. Um, and so bulky offense, if it doesn't have a threat to answer back, it just gets overran by hyper offense. Because hyper offense gets its set up much more quicker and much more naturally. And so bulky offense needs to stifle that setup and then reply with its own. And that's kind of how that matchup goes. But you will notice that with a lot of play, all of those matchups will be fairly intuitive. It's all about negating your opponent's win condition and then creating your own. Or, well, in the order of those two things depends highly on the playstyle you're using, on the pace you're using. Because if you're slow, stifling your opponent's win condition will come first, stopping whatever they're trying to do and just saying, no, in this game nothing happens until you die. That's the win condition. If you're playing fast, on the other hand, you don't really care about what your opponent is trying to do. You don't really care about if his Talfu Bulu has Worse Dance, if his Charizard has Dragon Dance. You want to kill them before they can do any of that. So the order of promoting your playstyle versus denying what the opponent wants to do, it depends on these things. But overall, you need to achieve both to some extent. And hyper offense and stall are incredibly rare playstyles. Just so we're clear, I'm mentioning them here because they're important to express the concepts, but a vast majority of teams, especially in draft, end up being those three. Because full stall really requires like Blissey and Skarmory and Mega Egg if you want, and unaware users and all of that type of boring things. Sometimes pure stall very often doesn't even have an active win condition in terms of damage, it just has an active win condition in terms of PP. You will run out of Fire Blasts, you will run out of whatever moves you're trying to use to break me, because I just have 16 recovery and I don't take much damage from them. And my 16 PP of recovery on every single mon eventually just end up being more health than you can do to me. And so that type of playstyle is a bit difficult to actually pull off in draft, first of all, because your opponent knows exactly what your build is before the game happens. Your opponent knows exactly that you're trying to do that thing, and so your opponent knows exactly your tools, your opponent knows exactly your weaknesses, and so it's a little difficult to pull off. And even if you wanted to pull it off, even if you could pull it off by virtue of being a good stall player, it's still not very fun in a fun league such as the one that we're having. So full stall you don't have to worry about too much, because it's just extreme. It takes everything to I don't know, levels that no one terribly enjoys. Hyper offense on the same page. It's very extreme. Some people like it. Some people do rain. Rain is fairly common. Trick Room is a hyper offense playstyle, or at least it should be, because you click Trick Room and it takes you just one turn, but it gives you 4 turns of being faster. So that's an artificial boost. Again, that's all that hyper offense wants to do. Just click one move that in one turn at best, hopefully it's 0, but at best 1, that move gives you a massive advantage for the next X turns, and you can use those X turns to accelerate everything and kind of make a mess and force the game to a game state where your opponent is losing Pokemon. But Trick Room in draft is very difficult to build because Magyarna is banned, and without gears, you don't really have a Pokemon that forces the issue as much. Because with Magyarna you can Trick Room, then you can Coal Mine, then you can Z Floor Cannon, you can just brute force through shit, get Solar boosts, you can really do a lot of damage in those 4 turns. While without Magyarna, it's a lot more difficult because Taka Taka doesn't have that level of breaking power, and things like Marowak, things like Rodent, that type of breaker, yes, they're very strong, but you need to set Trick Room and then switch them, so it's just not very practical. But in theory, Trick Room is a hyper offense playstyle. In practice, no one plays it. In practice, the only hyper offense you should really worry about is Rain, because even webs, it doesn't show up very often. I would like to see more webs because it's really fun. It's really entertaining to see webs done well. But yeah, it's a tricky one to play and to pilot. You really need to understand all of the conditions to your breaking, because if you don't end the game in 15 turns, then you lose. So yeah, most stuff ends up being here. Most teams end up having a fair deal of momentum. Oh yeah, I never explained why momentum is yellow here and here. Momentum is yellow here because again, limited turns to really use those setup abilities. Limited turns to use your rain turns. Limited turns to use your sticky web advantage before it gets defogged. Limited turns to really get to the wall breaking. And since you're playing hyper offense, you're just trying to kill the opponent before they kill you, because your stuff is frail, and most of the time the best answers are just going to be take 80% and deal 100 back when you're someone who is facing hyper offense. That's what you're trying to do: tank a hit and kill the threat in front of you. But what that implies is that when the hyper offense loses a Pokemon, then he gains momentum automatically because he can send another one, and that other one will be whatever is perfect to the situation. So that's natural momentum generation without needing artificial switching and U-turning. So that's why momentum in the sense of double switching and in the sense of U-turns is not as valuable for hyper offense as it is for other playstyles. Even though some rain teams like will really like U-turn on Pelipper, for example, so that it can switch out immediately after getting rain off. But that's more of a specific thing to rain, which is kind of on the border between hyper offense and bulky offense, depending on how it's built. And Stall, on the other hand, it doesn't care for momentum, because if you need momentum to live, then you're not going to live very long. Because momentum will naturally change over the course of a match. You will never get every single predict right. You will never always have a favorable matchup on the field. And so if you're not able to answer things, even when you don't have a favorable matchup on the field, then your stall team will collapse, because as soon as something happens, as soon as your opponent gets a switchback right, you die. And if that happens, then your stall team is not working. So what is the point of having favorable matchups in the first place if you don't... what is the point of running things that get you those favorable matchups if you are already prepared for the unfavorable matchups? That's the point. You don't need a U-turn because you already have things that can hard switch into anything and take 30% from whatever attacker is in front of you. You already have Chansey that doesn't need to be on the field before the attacker comes in. The special attacker can come in, the Nihilego or Alakazam or whatever is happening. That attacker can come in, it can click its stab move, and Chansey can just hard switch on it, take 10% without any worries or need to U-turn. There is no need for that if you're playing stall, because stall is already naturally hard to deal with situations where you don't have the favorable matchup. And so it's more about prolonging the game on and on and on with recovery moves until you just make that favorable matchup happen by prediction. And then when that favorable matchup happens, you get to click rocks or click toxic or click seismic toss, do a little bit of progress, and then continue switching around, playing passive until you have an opportunity for that again. And that concept applies to stall, but to stall a lot, but to a decent amount to semi-stall as well. Semi-stall likes to have momentum a lot though, because as I said, semi-stall really wants that strong breaker, really wants that that Charizard Y, or that even Superior is not perfectly this what it is not a perfect fit for the role of momentum abuser, but I had it in my last year's draft, so I bring it up because it's close enough. That is the role he played in my team. Just coming in and posing the immediate threat whenever I managed to generate enough momentum for it to get a turn. So yeah, this is something that you need to understand if you want to really step up your drafting and your play. And this is important in every single step of playing Pokemon. It's an intrinsic mechanic to how the game works. You cannot get good at Pokemon if you don't understand these basic concepts, and I've never seen them explained so graphically, so explicitly, because there are things that you kind of pick up naturally as you play the game. But it is like a very scientific and symmetrical scheme when you go and look at it. And so once you understand this concept, I think you are significantly better at knowing how to win a game of Pokemon than you were before you understood this concept. And how that plays into draft, this video has gone on for 40 minutes, so I will analyze in follow-ups how that plays into draft, how it plays into preparation, and how it plays into actual playing. Those are all things that we'll cover in follow-up videos. This is sort of like a preset, a base, something to build on, so that the next videos I can reference these concepts without anyone being confused or not really knowing what I mean, because I've just spent 40 minutes explaining what I mean. So if during the draft I say, I don't know, you have picked Celesteela, so you're naturally gravitating towards balance or semi-stall, you immediately understand why, because Celesteela is obviously a Pokemon that focuses on outlasting much more than momentum or setup. It doesn't pose much immediate threat. It doesn't really do anything even related to setup. It doesn't generate momentum. It doesn't do anything. It's just purely an outlasting Pokemon. At the end of the day, it's about clicking Leech Seed. It's about clicking Heavy Slam when you can, because you will get a lot of turns to Heavy Slam whenever you switch into things that cannot touch you. So Celesteela is a Pokemon about outlasting, and so that's why it's strong in balance and semi-stall. And I made this example now to kind of I want you to ask yourself, after hearing that example, did you understand why Celesteela was a balance or semi-stall pretty much exclusive Pokemon before I did the full explanation? If you did, then you've understood this video and we can move on. If you didn't, then I've not explained myself very well, and you want to either go back and rewatch or ask me in the Discord what parts of it you're unclear on, what part of it you didn't really understand. Because once you understand this concept, it should be really intuitive that a Pokemon like Celesteela cannot work unless you're playing semi-stall or balance. And even this would be a defensive brand of balance, because I don't know, I didn't want to add another color, but this is more like a lime. It's a very, very, very light green, trending towards yellow. Yeah. Balance is really like spot on that momentum niche. generate momentum and then use either scarfers or wall breakers. That's what balance is all about. And then you can sort of introduce setup or outlasting based on what you have in the draft to skew it towards semi-stall or bulky offense and give it a little more versatility as well. But naturally, that is what balance does. That dark green square in the middle. So yeah, I think those are all the concepts that needed to be stated as far as this goes. I know it's a long video, but I promise the next ones will be a lot shorter because this is like all the hard work, all the hard concepts to understand. Once you understand this, the next should be relatively a breeze. They're not as hard concepts. They're not as difficult in terms of complexity. It's all very simple, very self-explanatory things like many tricks in draft are just about prioritizing what is good in its pool and neglecting what is overpriced and all that kind of stuff. It's like it's not too complex, but that will come in the next video. That's something for not now. I will end this video now. 45 minutes ticked over. I hope you enjoyed this watch. Again, if there's anything, ask me in the Discord. I'll be glad to answer.